Imagine this scene. You're standing in an assembly hall on the island of Salamis in 479 BC. A councilman named Lycidas rises to his feet. He clears his throat. He proposes what seems like a rational idea. Perhaps we ought to consider the peace terms the Persians are offering. Nobody jeers, nobody shouts him down. Instead, his fellow councilmen close in around him like a pack of wolves. They pick up stones. Right there, on the assembly floor, they batter him to death. But the madness doesn't stop at the council doors. When the women of the city hear what Lycidas suggested, they storm to his residence. They drag his wife and his children out into the street and execute them with rocks. This isn't some dark fantasy. This happened. This was Greece in 479 BC. The age of reason and philosophy was over. These were broken people, refugees with nothing left to lose. The 300 heroes had fallen at Thermopylae. Athens was nothing but charred timber and rubble. Words had failed, only blood would. Speak now. This savage hatred, this absolute refusal to compromise, this is what sets the battlefield for the final reckoning. This is the story of Plataea, where the Greeks transformed from hunted prey into apex predators. Before we descend into these buried tales of desperation and slaughter, if you find yourself drawn to the darker corners of history that most people ignore, go ahead and smash that like button and subscribe for more stories like this one. And drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from. It amazes me that we're uncovering these ancient horrors together from every corner of the globe, bound together by our hunger to understand what our ancestors were truly capable of. The execution of Lycidas reveals everything you need to know about the Greek mindset. They were finished. King Xerxes had withdrawn, but he'd left behind something far deadlier than himself, General Mardonius. While Xerxes was a showman obsessed with spectacle, Mardonius was a professional killer. He'd positioned himself in the plains of Boeotia with 300,000 of Persia's most brutal soldiers. He wasn't camping, he was waiting, like a serpent coiled by a rabbit hole. To prove he wasn't going anywhere, he torched Athens a second time. The message was crystal clear. I'm still here, and I'm not leaving until you're all dead. The Athenians, scattered like refugees across the countryside, finally snapped. They dispatched messengers to Sparta, but these weren't diplomats begging for assistance. They were delivering an ultimatum. March your army north right now, or we'll take our entire navy and hand it over to Persia. And when that happens, your precious walls won't mean anything. It was the nuclear option, the threat that couldn't be ignored. The Spartans had been stalling for months. They'd barricaded themselves behind the Isthmus of Corinth, convincing themselves the problem would somehow resolve itself. But the prospect of Athens joining forces with the Persian Empire, that changed everything. When Sparta finally decides to act, the earth trembles. Within a single night, the ephors issued orders that defy comprehension. They didn't dispatch a scouting force or a token regiment. They evacuated the entire military-age population. 5,000 full Spartan citizens, the creme de la creme of their warrior class, armed themselves for war. But here's the detail that shows you how serious this was. They mobilized the Helots. For every Spartan warrior, 7 slaves were handed weapons and told to march. That's 35,000 enslaved men suddenly turned into soldiers. Add another 5,000 regional troops, and you're looking at a column of 45,000 men moving through the Peloponnese before dawn broke. When the Athenian diplomats woke up the next morning, ready to scream at the Spartan leadership, the ephors simply glanced at the rising sun and said, "Save your breath. Our army crossed the border hours ago. The hunt is already underway." While the Spartans were pushing north, raising clouds of dust and spreading terror in their wake, General Mardonius was orchestrating his next move. And this is the moment we need to shatter a fundamental lie about the Persian wars. Popular culture has convinced you that the Persians were some sort of disorganized mob. Hordes of poorly trained conscripts herded forward with whips and threats. That's Roman propaganda that somehow became historical fact. The force that Mardonius commanded in Greece bore no resemblance to the bloated invasion force Xerxes had dragged across the Hellespont. Mardonius had cut away the dead weight. He'd sent the useless mouths back home. What remained was 300,000 hardened killers operating like a precision instrument. These were the Immortals, the heavy shock troops who'd shattered the Spartan line at Thermopylae. These were the sucker-mounted archers from the steppes of Central Asia, men who could thread an arrow through your eye socket while galloping at full speed. Mardonius wasn't gambling on overwhelming numbers. He was betting on velocity, maneuverability, and tactical brilliance. When his scouts reported that the Spartan army had finally abandoned the Peloponnese, Mardonius didn't flinch. He grinned. This was the moment he'd been engineering for months. He understood that attempting to fight Greek heavy infantry in the cramped alleyways of Athens would be suicide. He needed open terrain. So he issued the command to abandon Athens, but not before delivering one final psychological blow. He ordered every structure still standing to be demolished. The walls, the homes, the sacred temples that had survived the first invasion were torn down, smashed to rubble, or consumed by flames. He converted Athens into a necropolis of broken stone, ensuring the Greeks would return to nothing but dust and memories. It was a strategy designed to break their spirits before the first spear was thrown. Then Mardonius marched his forces north into Boeotia near Thebes. This wasn't running away, this was setting a trap. He selected his killing ground with the care of a surgeon choosing where to make an incision. He established his base along the Asopus River in the wide, flat plains surrounding Plataea. Why that exact location? Because the Greek phalanx formation had a critical vulnerability: mobility. The phalanx was an impenetrable wall of bronze and muscle, absolutely, but it manoeuvred like a cargo ship. On open, level ground, Mardonius's cavalry could circle them, harass them from the flanks, and fill them with arrows until the formation shattered. He constructed a massive fortified compound, encompassing nearly a square mile of wooden palisades and watchtowers, creating an impregnable headquarters. He'd essentially built a military city in the middle of nowhere and settled in to wait for the Greeks to walk straight into his killing zone. And they almost did. The combined Greek forces, now swelling with reinforcements from every city-state that hadn't sold out to Persia, arrived at the southern boundary of the plain. They climbed to a vantage point on the foothills of Mount Cithaeron and gazed down at the sea of enemy tents stretching below them. They saw the Immortals' armour catching the sunlight like a field of mirrors. They saw thousands upon thousands of horses grazing along the riverbank. The Greek commanders, led by the Spartan Regent Pausanias, made the only intelligent decision available. They stopped moving. They refused to descend onto the flatlands. They clung to the rocky hillsides where Persian cavalry couldn't operate. It became a waiting game of epic proportions. Mardonius sitting comfortably in the valley. Pausanias perched on the ridge. Days crawled by. Mardonius grew restless. He hadn't remained in Greece to stare at Spartans from a distance. He'd stayed to butcher them. He decided to probe their defences. He didn't dispatch his infantry. He sent his cavalry commander, a man called Mecistius. Mecistius deserves to be immortalised on screen. He was the rock star of the Persian military, a physical giant who rode an Achaean warhorse with a bridle crafted from pure gold. He led a squadron of cavalry straight up the slopes to torment the Greek positions. They circled like vultures, howling insults and raining arrows down on the exposed Greek troops. They mocked the Spartans, calling them cowards hiding in the rocks. It was humiliating beyond measure. The Greeks were hemorrhaging casualties, powerless to retaliate against these lightning-fast raids. The Megarian contingent, a unit of Greek allies, found themselves pinned down and on the verge of collapse. They sent an urgent message to Pausanias: "Reinforce us immediately, or we're abandoning the position." Pausanias scanned his commanders. Who would be insane enough to volunteer to descend and engage cavalry on open ground? It was a death sentence, but 300 Athenians stepped forward, an echo of Leonidas's 300. They charged down the slope to support the Megarians, bringing their own archers. In the chaotic clash that erupted, fortune intervened. A stray arrow struck Mecistius's horse in the flank. The beast screamed and reared violently, hurling the Persian commander onto the ground. The instant he hit the earth, the Athenians swarmed over him like ants on honey. But here's a detail that demonstrates just how advanced Persian military technology was. They couldn't kill him. Mecistius was wearing scale armor beneath his purple cloak that was completely impervious to their weapons. The Greeks were hacking at him desperately, and their blades were simply deflecting off the metal scales. He was still fighting, a golden-armored titan, until one soldier recognized the weakness. He drove the spike at the base of his spear through the narrow eye slit in Mecistius's helmet. The giant crashed down, dead. The death of Mecistius sent shockwaves rippling through the Persian lines. The cavalry charged forward recklessly, desperate to recover his corpse, triggering a vicious, dust-choked brawl over the body. But the Greeks maintained their ground. They heaved Mecistius's corpse onto a wagon and paraded it through their ranks like a trophy. It was an enormous boost to morale. They'd drawn first blood. They'd killed the enemy's champion. But Pausanias understood. This was merely the opening act. Mardonius was observing from the valley floor, and his smile had vanished. The staring contest had ended. The real war was about to ignite. The euphoria from killing the Persian cavalry commander evaporated faster than morning dew on hot stone. It's August now. The Greek sun isn't just hot, it's crushing. Men trapped inside 60 pounds of bronze are cooking alive. Sweat is a constant river. Dehydration kills faster than any enemy weapon. Pausanias, the Spartan regent, assessed his army and recognized the crisis developing. They held the high ground, protected from cavalry assaults, but they were dangerously far from reliable water. Emboldened by their minor victory over Mecistius, Pausanias ordered a risky maneuver. The entire Greek line, all 100,000 men, shuffled down from their defensive positions toward the Asopus River, positioning themselves near a critical water source called the Gargaphia Spring. It appeared to be brilliant tactical thinking. It wasn't. Mardonius observed their movement. He didn't immediately attack. He didn't send his infantry charging across the river to engage them in pitched battle. Why would he? He recognized exactly what Pausanias had done. The Greeks had just exposed their throat. They were now within striking distance of the enemy, but more critically, their supply lines threading back through the mountain passes were now completely vulnerable. Mardonius smiled and unleashed his cavalry once more, but this time their objective wasn't killing soldiers, it was strangling the army. In a masterpiece of logistical warfare, Persian horsemen swept around the Greek forces and struck the mountain passes behind them. They intercepted a massive caravan of 500 supply wagons transporting food from the Peloponnese. They didn't just seize the wagons, they slaughtered every oxen driver, leaving the Greek army completely severed from resupply. Instantly, Plataea stopped being about combat. It became about starvation. For 8 agonizing days, the two armies sat locked in position. The Greeks were terrified to advance because the open terrain meant certain death against cavalry. They couldn't retreat without appearing to surrender, so they sat, roasting under the sun, while Mardonius methodically tightened his grip. Every single day, the Persian cavalry would approach the Asopus River, unleash volleys of arrows into the Greek positions, then withdraw while laughing. They were taunting the Spartans. "Why are you hiding? Come fight like warriors." But Pausanias held firm. He relied on that legendary iron discipline. He forbade his men from breaking formation under any circumstances. But discipline can't quench thirst. Then came the catastrophic turning point. On the 11th day, Mardonius decided he was tired of waiting. He ordered his cavalry to ignore the Greek battle line and strike their most vital asset, the Gargaphia Spring. This wasn't combat, this was sabotage. The Persian horses trampled the spring, churning the crystal-clear water into an undrinkable soup of mud and filth. Within hours, the only water source for an army of 100,000 men was destroyed. Imagine your situation. Night is falling. You haven't had a full meal in nearly 2 weeks. Your lips are split and bleeding from thirst. The spring is ruined. Enemy cavalry controls the roads behind you. You're trapped in a cage. Panic began spreading through the coalition like a plague. The commanders of the various Greek city-states started arguing violently. The Athenians demanded an immediate attack. The Corinthians wanted to withdraw. The Spartans refused to budge. Pausanias, the man desperately holding this fractured alliance together, understood he had no choice remaining. If they stayed even one more day, the army would disintegrate from thirst or mutiny. He made a decision that military historians consider one of the most perilous maneuvers in warfare: a tactical withdrawal at night while in contact with the enemy. The plan was elaborate but logical. During the second watch of the night, the entire army would silently pack up and fall back to a defensive position called the island, closer to the mountains and fresh water. It demanded absolute silence. It demanded perfect coordination. It demanded every single unit to move simultaneously without alerting the Persians, who were camped just a few hundred yards away. On paper, it was solid, but as anyone familiar with military history knows, plans disintegrate the moment reality arrives. As darkness fell and the moon climbed over the black silhouette of Mount Cithaeron, the Greeks prepared to execute their withdrawal. They had no idea they were about to stumble into a cascade of disasters that would nearly destroy Western civilization. If you want to comprehend why Plataea was such an absolute disaster, you need to understand what happened during that night. The concept was straightforward: pull back to the high ground, regroup, and access fresh water. But the instant the signal was given, the coalition collapsed. The centre of the Greek line, composed of troops from Corinth, Megara, and other city-states, didn't execute a controlled withdrawal. They panicked. They grabbed their shields and essentially sprinted away from the front lines. They didn't halt at the designated fallback position. They kept running all the way back to the town of Plataea itself, clustering around the temple of Hera, effectively removing themselves from the battle. In the darkness, the Greek army had just lost half its fighting strength because of fear. But on the right flank, where the Spartans were positioned, the problem wasn't fear, it was arrogance. This brings us to one of the most obstinate individuals in recorded history, Captain Amompharetus. He commanded the Lokos of Pitanas, an elite Spartan formation. When the order came down from Pausanias to withdraw, Amompharetus simply refused. He planted himself in place, surrounded by his men, and informed the regent of Sparta that he would not disgrace his homeland by fleeing from the barbarians, his contemptuous term for the Persians. Visualize the scene. It's 2 IOM, pitch darkness. The rest of the army is attempting to sneak away in complete silence, and here's Pausanias, the supreme commander of Greek forces, locked in a screaming argument with one of his own captains. Pausanias pleaded with him. He explained this wasn't a retreat, it was tactical repositioning. Amompharetus didn't care about wordplay. To a Spartan raised on the mythology of Thermopylae, stepping backward was blasphemy. The argument escalated physically. Amompharetus picked up an enormous rock with both hands, a heavy stone from the river. He slammed it down at Pausanias' feet with a crash that must have echoed across the valley. He pointed at the boulder and declared, "With this pebble, I register my vote against fleeing from the barbarians." In Spartan culture, they cast votes using pebbles. Amompharetus was mockingly using a massive boulder to vote for death. While this absurd family drama was unfolding, the Athenians on the left flank were sitting in confusion. They understood the Spartans were supposed to move first, but nothing was happening. They dispatched a runner to the Spartan camp to investigate. The Athenian messenger arrived to find the Spartan commanders screaming at each other while the army stood frozen. The messenger essentially asked, "Gentlemen, the sun is rising. Are we withdrawing or not?" Pausanias, exhausted and furious, finally made a brutal decision. He chose to abandon Amompharetus. He ordered the main Spartan force to begin the retreat, gambling that once Amompharetus witnessed his comrades leaving, he would swallow his pride and follow. It was a game of chicken wagered with thousands of lives. The primary Spartan column began marching south, dragging their feet, constantly glancing back. And predictably, when Amompharetus realized he was genuinely being left behind to face 300,000 Persians alone, he finally broke. He ordered his unit to collect their shields and jog to catch up. But it was too late. The sky was turning grey. Birds were beginning to sing. The sun was cresting over the mountains. From the Persian camp across the river, the sentries rubbed sleep from their eyes. They gazed out at the Greek positions. The centre was gone. The Athenians were miles distant on one flank, hidden by hills. And on the other side, isolated and exposed on the rolling slopes, were the Spartans stretched out in a long, disorganized column with Amompharetus's unit straggling behind like a lost puppy. General Mardonius emerged from his tent and saw the gift the gods had delivered. He didn't perceive a tactical maneuver. He saw a rout. He saw a shattered army fleeing in terror. He turned to his commanders, laughing. He mocked the legendary Spartan reputation, shouting, "These are the men who supposedly never retreat. Look at them running." He didn't wait for his infantry to properly form battle lines. He didn't wait to develop an elaborate battle plan. He simply pointed at the retreating red cloaks and roared, "Kill them all!" The dam exploded. The Persian cavalry surged forward, crossing the river in a thundering avalanche. Behind them, the elite Immortals and the remaining infantry began running, screaming their war cries. There was no discipline, no formation, just a massive chaotic stampede of predators chasing wounded prey. Pausanias, marching up the ridge, heard the sound first, a low rumble that transformed into a roar. He spun around and watched the horizon fill with dust. He looked at his scattered column. He looked at the Athenians far away on the left, unable to assist. He looked at his allies, cowering in Plataea. He was isolated. 10,000 Spartans and 35,000 lightly armed Helots against the entire Persian Empire. The time for clever tactics had ended. The Battle of Plataea had officially begun, and the Spartans were caught completely off guard. The sun climbs higher, and with it comes death's shadow. Mardonius didn't send his infantry charging in for honourable combat. He was too intelligent for that. He ordered his archers, tens of thousands of them, to plant their wicker shields in the earth, forming a portable wall, and then to simply blot out the sun with arrows. This is where Plataea transforms into a nightmare. The Spartans and their Tegean allies, totaling roughly 53,000 men, found themselves stranded on the exposed slopes of the Scytheron range. They weren't in battle formation. They were caught in mid-march as Persian cavalry swarmed their flanks and infantry archers unleashed endless volleys. The natural human response would be to either charge or flee. Pausanias did neither. He ordered the army to halt and drop to one knee. Then, amid the screaming of dying men and the metallic clatter of thousands of arrows striking bronze shields, he turned his back on the enemy. He called for a priest. He needed to perform a tawla, sacrifice. In the ancient Greek world, you didn't fight until the gods approved. A goat was dragged forward. Pausanias slit its throat and examined the liver for omens. The signs were bad. The gods said no. So Pausanias waited. Put yourself in that line. You're crouching behind your shield. You hear the constant thud, thud, thud of arrows hammering the bronze face. You hear the screams of the men beside you as arrows discover the gaps in armour, the throat, the groin, the exposed feet. And your general is staring at goat entrails, shaking his head. Now shift your perspective. Look at the man crouching behind the Spartan. This is a Helot. He doesn't have a bronze shield. He has a wicker basket or animal hide. He's a slave, dragged here to haul supplies and hurl javelins for a master who treats him like property. But right now, the arrows don't care about social class. The Helots were being slaughtered by the hundreds. For them, this wasn't noble discipline. It was madness. They were watching their masters stand like statues, refusing to defend themselves, while the world burned around them. The massacre was passive, industrial, and agonizingly slow. One of the most heartbreaking casualties was a Spartan named Helot. Herodotus records that he was the most beautiful man in the entire Greek army, a perfect physical specimen. Before the battle even officially commenced, an arrow plunged into his torso. He was dragged to the rear, dying slowly in agony. His final words weren't about pain, they were about frustration. He told a comrade, "I don't regret dying for Greece. What I regret is dying without ever raising my weapon, without ever using my hands." This continued for what felt like eternity. Another goat was brought forward. Throat slit, liver examined. Bad omens, wait. The Persian infantry, emboldened by the lack of resistance, moved closer. They were now within shouting distance, pouring arrows into the motionless Greek ranks. The Tegeans, the allies on the Spartan flank, couldn't endure it anymore. They began to shift, preparing to charge without orders. Pausanias glared at them. He looked up toward the temple of Hera on the distant hillside, tears streaming down his face, a rare emotional display for a Spartan. He screamed a prayer to the goddess, begging her not to let them perish in shame. It was the ultimate test of Greek military doctrine. The phalanx is powerful, but its weakness is inflexibility. But here, that inflexibility, that conditioned obedience to orders, was the only thing preventing a complete rout. If they had charged individually, the cavalry would have massacred them. By forcing them to endure in place, Pausanias was maintaining formation integrity. Finally, just as the Tegeans were about to disobey and charge on their own initiative, a third goat was sacrificed. Pausanias examined the organs. The liver was favourable. The omens had shifted. Pausanias stood. He didn't deliver a speech. He didn't need a trumpet. He simply raised his spear. The iron discipline that had kept 10,000 men frozen under a storm of arrows suddenly released like a coiled spring. The statues came to life. The Spartans didn't just advance, they exploded forward. The accumulated rage from an hour of passive suffering was about to be unleashed on the Persian line. The waiting had ended. The butchery was beginning. The collision of the two armies wasn't the romantic clash of bronze on bronze. It was the sickening crunch of wood splintering under the impact of bronze. The Persians had erected a barrier of wicker shields to protect their archers. Against light infantry, these shields were effective. Against a charging Spartan phalanx, they might as well have been constructed from paper. When Pausanias lowered his spear, the Spartans didn't just charge forward. They surged like a tsunami. They crashed into the Persian line with such kinetic energy that the front ranks of Immortals were literally lifted off their feet and crushed. The wicker barrier disintegrated instantly. Now the battle entered the phase the Greeks called the othismos, the push. And this is where the technological advantage of the West became lethal. The Persians were courageous. Let's be absolutely clear about this. They were not cowards. Herodotus vividly describes them grabbing Spartan spears with their bare hands and attempting to snap the wooden shafts to disarm their enemies. They hurled themselves at the shield wall with daggers and short swords, desperately searching for gaps. They fought with the ferocity of cornered animals. But courage cannot overcome physics. The Persians were wearing linen tunics or scale armour designed to deflect arrows, not stop heavy spear thrusts. The Spartans, conversely, were encased in bronze from neck to shin. When a Persian struck a Spartan, his blade frequently glanced off the curved shield or breastplate. When a Spartan struck a Persian, he penetrated bone. Once the long spears shattered in the initial collision, the Spartans drew their xiphos, the short, leaf-bladed sword engineered for close-quarters slaughter. This is where the Spartan vengeance truly began. They moved with robotic, industrial efficiency. Thrust to the face, bash with the shield rim, step forward over the corpse, repeat. The Helots, who'd been dying passively under the arrow bombardment, now flooded into the gaps. Armed with slings, javelins, and knives, they finished off the wounded Persians that the Spartans knocked down. It was a meat grinder. The dust rose so thick that men fought by shadow and sound. The screaming was unending, mixture of Persian commands and the animalistic roars of Greeks releasing months of accumulated frustration. In the centre of this swirling chaos rode Mardonius. Unlike Xerxes, who observed battles from a comfortable throne on a distant hill, Mardonius was in the thick of the carnage. He sat atop a magnificent white stallion, surrounded by his elite bodyguard of 1,000 hand-picked warriors. He was fighting brilliantly, cutting down any Spartan foolish enough to break formation. His presence was the adhesive, holding the Persian army together. As long as they could see that white horse and the general's purple cloak, the Persians continued fighting, even as they were being systematically slaughtered. The Spartans saw him too. They recognized this wasn't just a battle of attrition, it was an assassination. The phalanx shifted its weight. Like a predator detecting blood, the Spartan line began grinding its way toward the man on the white horse. They ignored the piles of gold and silver, jewelry adorning the fallen Immortals. They ignored the expensive fabrics and treasures. They wanted the head of the man who'd burned Athens to ashes. The distance between Pausanias' front line and Mardonius' bodyguard began to shrink. The Persians threw everything they possessed into the gap to protect their commander: bodies, horses, camp furniture. But the bronze wall kept advancing, step by bloody step. The sacrifice Pausanias had offered to the gods was no longer a goat. It was the Persian army itself. The protective circle around Mardonius was contracting. The 1,000 elite Persians guarding him were dying one by one, their bodies forming a ramp of flesh that the Spartans climbed to reach their target. This wasn't combat anymore. It was an assassination executed by an entire army. History preserves the name of the man who delivered the killing blow, Arimnestos. He was a Spartan of tremendous reputation, a man whose name roughly translates to the one remembered. And on this day, he earned that name eternally. Arimnestos spotted Mardonius on his white stallion, rising above the dusty chaos like a beacon in a storm. The Persian general was fighting valiantly, cutting down Spartans from his saddle. But valor is no defense against a 20-pound ash spear, driven by the muscle of a man who's trained for war since childhood. Arimnestos lunged. The blow was devastating. Some accounts claim a rock crushed Mardonius' skull. Others say a spear pierced his chest. The result was identical. The general of the Persian Empire, the cousin of Xerxes, the burner of Athens, was knocked from his horse and slammed into the blood-soaked dirt of Boeotia. He didn't rise. The moment Mardonius hit the ground, the sound of battle transformed. The roar of the Persian army faltered. Ancient armies operated like serpents, sever the head, and the body convulses and dies. The Immortals, witnessing their leader fallen, finally broke. These men, who'd never retreated, who'd terrorized the known world, threw down their wicker shields and ran. But the most revealing moment came from Artabazus, the second in command of Persian forces. He'd been commanding a reserve force of 40,000 men, a force large enough to potentially flank the Spartans and reverse the battle. But Artabazus was a survivor above all else. He observed from a distance as Mardonius fell. He saw the Spartan machine grinding forward inexorably. He calculated the odds. Instead of charging forward to rescue the situation, he wheeled his horse around and ordered his 40,000 men to march in the opposite direction. Not back to camp, but straight out of Greece entirely. He abandoned the army to its fate. It was a cold, calculated betrayal that sealed the doom of everyone left behind. The remaining Persian forces, leaderless, terrified and abandoned, panicked completely. They didn't execute an organized withdrawal. They routed. A chaotic river of humanity flowed backward toward the massive wooden stockade they'd constructed days earlier. They scrambled inside the wooden walls, barred the gates, and climbed the towers, desperately hoping the fortifications would protect them. They were catastrophically wrong. They'd just trapped themselves in a cage with a tiger. The Spartans arrived at the stockade walls shortly afterward. But here's an interesting fact. Spartans were atrocious at siege warfare. They were trained to fight on open battlefields, not to scale walls. For a moment, the Persians held them at bay, raining arrows down on the Spartans pacing below like frustrated predators. It appeared to be a stalemate, but then the Athenians arrived. Remember them? They'd been engaged fighting the pro-Persian Greek forces on the opposite side of the battlefield. But hearing of the victory, they sprinted to join the Spartans. And unlike the Spartans, the Athenians were engineers. They understood how to breach fortifications. The Athenians destroyed the stockade. They tore down a section of the wooden rampart, creating a breach, and through that breach poured the complete, undiluted fury of the Greeks. What transpired inside that fortification was not a battle, it was extermination. This is the segment of Plataea that history textbooks frequently gloss over because it's deeply uncomfortable. The Greeks didn't accept prisoners, they didn't acknowledge surrenders. They moved through the crowded camp where tens of thousands of Persians were trapped with nowhere to escape, and they killed everything that moved. It was a systematic genocide. The frustration of Thermopylae, the rage over Athens' destruction, the misery of the thirsty siege, it was all unleashed on the trapped Persians. The ground inside the fortification became a quagmire of mud and blood, so deep it reached soldiers' ankles. Of the nearly 260,000 Persians who'd remained with Mardonius, excluding Artabazus's deserters, ancient sources claim only 3,000 survived the day. While these numbers are likely inflated by Greek historians, the archaeological evidence is unambiguous. An entire generation of Persian military power was obliterated from existence in a single afternoon. When the screaming finally ceased, an eerie silence descended over the carnage. The dust settled on the greatest mass grave the Greek world had ever witnessed. But as the Spartans and Athenians wiped the gore from their eyes, they began to comprehend something else. They were standing on a treasure trove. The Persian camp wasn't just a military installation, it was a travelling palace. Mardonius had inherited King Xerxes' personal tent when the monarch fled, and he'd been living in imperial luxury. We're discussing gold mixing vessels, silver tables, tapestries woven with purple dye worth more than a soldier's annual wages, and chests overflowing with minted Persian coins. For the Greeks, who lived relatively austere lives, especially the Spartans, whose currency was literally heavy iron bars designed to discourage hoarding, this was like stumbling into a fantasy. There's a legendary story from Herodotus that perfectly captures the absurdity of this moment. It's perhaps the defining scene of the entire Greco-Persian conflict. General Pausanias, still coated in the filth of battle, entered Mardonius's pavilion. He gazed at the silk draperies and gold-plated furniture. He saw the Persian chefs, terrified and cowering in the corner. Instead of executing them, Pausanias issued a bizarre command. He instructed them to prepare a meal exactly as they would have for Mardonius. The chefs went to work. They roasted exotic meats, baked delicate breads, opened amphorae of sweet wine, and arranged a feast worthy of royalty on silver platters. The tent filled with the aroma of saffron and roasting meat. Then Pausanias turned to his own Spartan cooks and issued a second order. Prepare a standard Spartan meal. The Spartan cooks threw some lentils, pig's blood, and vinegar into a pot and boiled it into the infamous black broth, a meal so unappetizing that a visitor once remarked, "Now I comprehend why Spartans aren't afraid of death." Pausanias positioned the two meals side by side. On the left, the culinary pinnacle of the greatest empire on earth. On the right, a bowl of brown sludge. He summoned his commanders into the tent. He gestured to the Persian feast, then to the Spartan slop, and began laughing. He declared to them, "Men of Greece, I brought you here to demonstrate the folly of the Median leader. Observe how he lived. He possessed all this luxury, yet he came here to rob us, who possess so little." It was a moment of profound irony. The Persians had everything to lose and nothing to gain. The Greeks had nothing to lose except their freedom. That contrast between Eastern opulence and Western austerity became the propaganda narrative that would define Western identity for centuries. But in retrospect, it was also a warning. Pausanias stood there, mocking the gold, performing the role of the incorruptible Spartan. But history reveals that as he stared at that wealth, something inside him fractured. The man who mocked the feast would soon become addicted to its taste. The victory at Plataea saved Greece, but it condemned Pausanias. The seeds of his own destruction were planted right there among the laughter and the plunder. While the blood was drying in Plataea's dirt, something almost supernatural was transpiring across the Aegean Sea. Legend claims that on the exact same afternoon, the Greek fleet launched an amphibious assault on the Persian remnants at Mycale on the Asia Minor coast. They burned the Persian ships, massacred their garrison, and effectively terminated the Persian wars in a single synchronized strike. The great King Xerxes had no army remaining in Europe and no navy left to transport one. The West was preserved. But history possesses a cruel sense of irony. The war's end was simply the tragedy's beginning. The alliance between Sparta and Athens had always been a marriage of convenience, like a wolf and a shark temporarily cooperating. Once the prey was dead, they regarded each other with suspicion. Athens, intoxicated by the confidence of their naval victories, returned home not as refugees, but as conquerors. They rebuilt their walls, constructed a massive fleet, and formed the Delian League, an empire in everything but name. They took the freedom they'd fought for at Plataea and monetized it, demanding tribute from other islands. The golden age of Athens was constructed on the reputation earned in the blood of 479 BC. But the darkest shadow fell upon Plataea's hero himself, General Pausanias. Remember that feast? The moment he mocked Persian luxury? It turns out he wasn't mocking it because he despised it. He was mocking it because he craved it. The man who'd commanded the Spartan army's iron discipline returned home, but his soul remained in Mardonius's tent. Gradually, bizarre reports began reaching the Spartan ephors. Travelers claimed Pausanias was no longer behaving like a Spartan. When dispatched abroad on campaigns, he ceased wearing his people's rough red cloak. Instead, he appeared wearing the long purple robes of a Persian satrap. He stopped consuming black broth and began dining on elaborate feasts. Even worse, he hired a private bodyguard of Egyptians and Persians to surround him, refusing to allow fellow Greeks near. It was inconceivable. This was Sparta's regent, the man who'd avenged Leonidas, now cosplaying as the enemy he'd destroyed. Rumours circulated that he was secretly corresponding with Xerxes, offering to deliver all of Greece to Persia in exchange for marrying the king's daughter. The saviour of Western civilization had become a traitor. The Spartans, terrified of his growing power and erratic behaviour, recalled him to Sparta. They put him on trial, but he was acquitted due to insufficient hard evidence, and likely because of his royal lineage. But Pausanias didn't stop. He continued his intrigues, allegedly inciting the Helots, the very slaves he'd commanded at Plataea, promising them freedom if they assisted him in overthrowing the Spartan government. That was the final straw. To a Spartan, conspiring with Persia was terrible, but arming the Helots was unforgivable. It violated the fundamental social contract of their society. The ephors needed proof. They set a trap. They had a servant conceal himself behind a partition while Pausanias discussed his treasonous plans. The evidence was secured. The most celebrated general in the world, Plataea's victor, was now a hunted man in his own city. He wasn't defeated by a Persian arrow or cavalry charge. He was defeated by his own ego. The poison of victory had accomplished what Mardonius never could. It destroyed the Spartan leader. And as the ephors marched to arrest him, Pausanias made one final desperate flight, not to a battlefield, but to a temple. Pausanias, the man who'd broken the Persian Empire, fled for his life through Sparta's streets. He wasn't fleeing an enemy army. He was fleeing his own people. He sprinted into the temple of Athena of the Brazen House, claiming sanctuary. In the ancient world, Killing a man inside a temple meant angering the gods. The ephors arrived at the temple doors and halted. They were constrained by their own laws. They couldn't drag him out, and they couldn't enter with swords. So they devised a solution that was uniquely, horrifyingly Spartan. If they couldn't touch him, they'd simply ensure he never left. They ordered the doors bricked up, and here's the detail that cuts deepest. Legend tells us that, as the Spartans gathered stones to seal the entrance, an old woman walked through the crowd. It was Pausanias' own mother. She didn't weep. She didn't plead for her son's life. She simply picked up a heavy stone, walked to the temple door, and placed it on the threshold in silence. Then she walked away. It was the ultimate rejection. By placing that first stone, she was voting for his death, choosing Sparta's honor over her child's life. For days, Plataea's hero sat in the temple's darkness. No food, no water, just the sound of his own breathing and the smell of incense he could no longer offer. As he lay dying of starvation, the ephors waited outside. Just moments before his heart stopped, they dragged his emaciated body out into the sunlight so he wouldn't die inside and spiritually contaminate the sacred ground. He died essentially a prisoner, a traitor, and a disgrace. This is why we don't make movies about Plataea. It's messy, it's complicated. The hero becomes the villain. The good guys commit war crimes. Victory leads to greed and imperialism. Compare that to Thermopylae. Thermopylae is clean. The 300 die. They're beautiful, noble, and morally pure because they didn't survive long enough to be corrupted. We prefer the beautiful defeat to the ugly victory. We prefer the martyr. Leonidas to the conqueror Pausanias. But we mustn't forget the truth. Thermopylae was a symbol, but Plataea was the salvation. It was at Plataea, on those dusty, blood-drenched plains, that 10,000 Spartans and their allies accomplished the impossible. They stared the apocalypse in the eye and didn't flinch. They proved that free people fighting for their homes and laws could shatter the spine of a global superpower. It was brutal, it was savage, and it was necessary. So the next time you hear about the 300 Spartans, remember the 10,000 who came after them. Remember the vengeance, remember the victory, and remember the cost. If you've made it this far, you're a genuine history enthusiast. Please confirm your subscription now. It genuinely helps the channel keep these forgotten stories alive. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next video.